Our first witness is Mr. Hassan. Mr. Hassan is an associate fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Mr. Hassan co-authored ISIS Inside the Army of Terror. In 2008, he started working in Abu Dhabi in journalism and research focusing on Syria, Iraq, and Gulf states, and studying Islamicists, Salafists, and jihadist movements in the wider region. Mr. Hassan.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Carper, members of the committee. By way of introduction, I also want to add that I come from an ISIS-controlled area that is still controlled today. I've also interviewed dozens of ISIS members for my book and other research. And I want to say this: this is not a sectarian war. The very people that ISIS claims to represent are victims of its brutality just as much as everyone else. This is reality felt on a daily basis. When family and friends go to the market and see severed heads on pipes, or when ISIS condemns its Sunni opponents, people that they claim to represent as apostates, they burn them alive, they stab their hearts before they shoot them, they display their dead bodies for days in central squares. When it says to its fellow Sunnis, it doesn't matter if you pray, if you fast in Ramadan, if you turn your face towards Mecca and pray, we will still kill you as long as you don't pledge allegiance to us. Not far from where I come from, in my area called Deir Zor, ISIS killed 700 Sunni villagers in a matter of days because they dared to stand up against the group. I want to move on to say that as a belief system, those who believe in the in the sort of Islamic State ideology are a minority, not only in the Muslim world, but also within the group. During my research, I found that members come in 6 categories. One, long-standing religious radicals who deviate even from Al-Qaeda. For example, they believe that there's no sanctity of life. Unlike Al-Qaeda, which for example, justifies killing civilians, but only as collateral damage, ISIS considers killing civilians itself is the preferred outcome. In fact, just like a month ago, exactly a month ago, the spokesperson of ISIS said, when he called for sympathizers in the West, in Europe, and in the United States to launch attacks, he said, I received complaints from people, sympathizers, saying we couldn't find military targets and we are afraid to kill civilians. And he said there's no such thing as innocent civilians in the West. And in fact, he moved on to say, we prefer that you kill civilians. And he said, I don't have time to justify that. Basically, he didn't even have the justification during the statement. And the second category of people who join ISIS are young zealots who are victims of the first category. People who are, between 12 to 17. People who are drawn to this idea of a caliphate and so on and so forth. They're brainwashed. They are taught Islam in a way that ISIS understands. It distorts a lot of things, and because people don't have religious knowledge, they hear a lot of the events and the traditions that ISIS relates for the first time. And there's a third category, which is very important, people who are drawn to ISIS political ideology, not religious one, and this is a major problem, not only within ISIS, but I think in the region. People who are drawn to this political ideology, not only for ISIS but Al-Qaeda and other Islamist groups, because they think there is political stagnation in the region, and only these groups can actually shake up the political order in the region. And I think Omar Mateen belongs to this category of people who are only superficially influenced by this organization. He obviously didn't follow their way of life, but he was still animated probably by this idea of the Islamic State. The other categories are those who are drawn to the group because of its military success, model of governance, attraction to brutality, and or simply they're profiteers. But the group and this is important, but the group swims in a sea of political failures in the region, and that's where we should focus. It's not a surprise, for example, that ISIS emerged in Iraq and in Syria, countries that suffered unimaginable brutality, violence over the past decade in the case of Iraq, and half-decade in the case of Syria. The group has built its narrative around the idea of Sunni victimization. It benefited from the brutal reality in both Iraq and Syria to say that Sunnis are systematically under attack by Iranian-backed militias or governments or governments in those two countries, and that the two greatest superpowers in the world are helping both of them, and that there are traitors, apostates, in other words, in our midst who help them. It's important, without downplaying the genocidal acts of ISIS, to highlight that the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Damascus had carried out almost all the atrocities, probably without an exception, that ISIS has committed even before ISIS arrived in Syria. In 2012, for example, pro-government militias in Syria stormed villages, slaughtered children and women, and smashed using rocks at the heads of condemned people. And I just want to conclude by saying and emphasizing that ISIS thrives in this context and should be defeated in this context to stem its international appeal. This can only happen at the hands of the very people that ISIS claims to represent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hassan.